All right, let's dive deep today
Mhm.
into the mind of Giambattista Vico. You've shared some excerpts from the Sanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and wow, I'm intrigued.
Yeah, it's a really great pick. Vico is one of those thinkers who was so ahead of his time. Still relevant today, especially for philosophers.
Okay, so for our philosophically inclined listener today, set the stage.
Hmm.
Who was this guy, and what made him so different from the philosophical kind of giants of his era?
All right, so imagine 17th century Italy, right? Dominated by figures like Descartes, who champion reason, logic as the ultimate paths to knowledge. But then you have Vico.
I love that image of him going against the grain. Was he formally trained as a philosopher?
He was largely self-taught, actually,
Hmm.
which is pretty remarkable. He had a difficult childhood, including a serious accident that impacted his health, but his thirst for knowledge. Unstoppable. He ended up having a long career in academia, but it's fascinating that he was largely unrecognized in his own lifetime.
So a true philosophical underdog. What were some of the key ideas that set him apart from the mainstream thinkers of his time?
Well, one of the most radical things Vico argued was against Descartes' idea that clear and distinct ideas were the primary source of truth. He proposed this concept called verum factum, which essentially means the true is the made.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Sounds like he's saying we can't just think our way to truth. We have to create it, experience it.
Exactly. Vico believed that true knowledge comes not just from abstract reasoning, but from understanding how things are created and evolve over time. It's a very constructivist perspective, something we see echoed in many modern philosophical schools of thought. For a 17th century thinker to articulate that is pretty mind-blowing.
So for our listener who's steeped in philosophy, this is like a precursor to ideas we see in pragmatism or even phenomenology, right?
Absolutely. He was grappling with questions about the nature of knowledge, the role of experience, the limits of reason centuries before those schools of thought emerged. And this leads us to another crucial concept, his idea of scienza, which doesn't translate directly to our modern understanding of science.
Okay, so we're talking about science with some philosophical asterisks here. How would you explain scienza to our listener?
Think of it as a kind of deep, integrated knowledge that doesn't just describe the world, but helps us understand how it came to be and how it continues to evolve. For Vio, this involved understanding history, culture, language, all those elements that shape human experience.
So it's like a holistic understanding of the world, recognizing that knowledge isn't just about dissecting things into their smallest parts, but also seeing how they fit together in a larger dynamic whole.
Precisely. And this brings us to his magnum opus, The New Science. In it, he lays out this incredibly complex and insightful vision of history as a cyclical process, a series of recurring patterns that shape the rise and fall of civilizations.
Ah, the cyclical view of history. So one of those ideas that make you feel like you're on a philosophical roller coaster. Tell me more. What are some of the key elements of Vico's cyclical history?
Well, he believed that societies evolve through distinct stages, which he called the ages of gods, heroes, and men. And what's interesting is that he saw this cycle repeating itself, but with each iteration building on the achievements and failures of the past.
So it's not a simple loop, but more like a spiral, where societies might decline and fall, but they also rise again. Carrying forward the lessons learned. I can see how this would be a fascinating idea for a philosopher to grapple with. What were some of the defining features of each of these ages?
Imagine the earliest human societies, right? Steeped in myth and ritual, where the natural world is imbued with spirits and gods. Their language is poetic, full of metaphor and imagery. This is the age of gods, where knowledge is intertwined with religion and superstition.
A world of wonder and terror, where the line between reality and myth is blurred. That's a potent image. Then how does this age transition into the age of heroes?
Well, think about figures like Achilles or Odysseus. Larger-than-life individuals emerge, embodying strength, cunning, and a thirst for glory. Aristocratic republics start to form. Laws are based on the power of the heroic class, and there's a shift from divine authority to human prowess.
So a more human-centric world where individuals start to assert their will and shape their destiny. But there's still this element of myth and legend, right? These heroic figures are almost like demigods, bridging the gap between the divine and the human.
Absolutely. And this leads to the age of men, where reason and reflection take center stage. We see the rise of philosophy, science, and democracy. Humans believe they can understand the world through their own intellect and create a more just and equitable society based on human laws and institutions.
So in a sense, each age represents a different way of knowing, a different way of relating to the world and to each other. And for our philosopher listener, I can see how this framework would be incredibly rich territory for exploring questions about epistemology, ethics, even political philosophy.
Exactly. And what's so brilliant about Vico is that he recognized the inherent tensions within each of these ages, you see, the seeds of their own decline. He argued that even in the age of men, there's a danger of what he called the barbarism of reflection.
Okay, that phrase definitely needs some unpacking. Barbarism of reflection. How can reflection, the very thing that marks the age of men, lead to barbarism?
Vico was deeply wary of reason becoming too detached from the vital imaginative forces that drive human creativity and social progress. He feared that a society overly obsessed with reason and order could become sterile, bureaucratic, and ultimately lose its soul.
It's like a cautionary tale for our own times. We often celebrate the power of reason and technology, but Vico seems to be saying that we need to be careful not to lose touch with our humanity, with our capacity for empathy, imagination, and even myth-making.
Precisely, and that's why he believed that understanding history was so crucial. By studying the past, we can see these patterns playing out, learn from the mistakes of previous societies, and hopefully make wiser choices in the present.
And this understanding of history as a cyclical process, it brings us back to Vico's idea of recurso right, this concept of return or relapse within the historical cycles.
Exactly. And for Vico, Ricorso isn't just about decline, it's also about renewal, about the seeds of a new cycle being planted, even as the old one crumbles. He believed that each cycle carries forward the lessons of the past, even if in a transformed form.
So it's not a simple repetition, but more like a spiral, each turn building on the achievements and failures of the past. I can see why Vico would be fascinating to someone who's deeply engaged with philosophical questions about progress, decline, and the very nature of history itself.
It's a powerful concept, and it really gets to the heart of Vico's vision. He saw history as a dynamic interplay between progress and decline, creation and destruction, a constant process of becoming. And that brings us to another crucial aspect of Vico's thought, his emphasis on the poetic origins of society.
This is where it gets really fascinating, especially for someone coming from a philosophical perspective. We often think of poetry as something separate from, even opposed to philosophy, but Vico seems to see them as intertwined.
He does. Vico believed that early humans, those sublime poets as he called them, used language to make sense of the world long before the development of complex philosophical systems. They explained the world through myths, metaphors, and stories.
So it's like saying that poetry, or at least a poetic way of thinking, was the foundation of human understanding, a precursor to philosophy itself.
Exactly. And this brings us to Vico's fascinating analysis of Homer. He argued that Homer's epics, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, weren't just the work of a single genius. Instead, he saw them as a reflection of the sensus communis of the ancient Greeks.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. Sensus communis. It's not just common sense as we understand it today, right?
Right. Think of it more as a shared understanding of the world. A set of beliefs, values, and ways of seeing things that were common to a particular culture at a particular time. Vico believed that Homer's poems captured the essence of the ancient Greek sensus communis, their way of life, their moral code, their worldview.
So the poems weren't just stories. They were a kind of cultural encyclopedia, a repository of wisdom and knowledge that shaped how the Greeks understood themselves and their place in the world. For a philosopher, this raises all sorts of questions about the nature of language, the relationship between culture and thought, and even the possibility of objective truth.
Absolutely. Vico's analysis of Homer challenges us to think about the role of narrative in shaping our understanding of reality.
Oh.
It suggests that truth isn't just something we discover through reason alone, it's also something we create through language, through storytelling, through shared experiences.
And this idea of sensus communis, it's not just a relic of the past, is it? We still have our own shared understandings, our own cultural narratives that shape how we see the world. It's like saying that each generation creates its own Homer, its own set of stories and myths that reflect its values and beliefs.
That's a great insight, and it's one of the reasons why Vico's work is still so relevant today. He helps us see how these cultural narratives operate, how they shape our perceptions, and how they can be both empowering and limiting.
So for our philosopher listener, Vico is offering a powerful tool for analyzing not just ancient cultures, but also our own contemporary world. He's helping us see the hidden structures of thought, the underlying assumptions that shape how we make sense of reality.
Exactly. And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of Vico's thought, his idea of the three kinds of natural law. Now, you might be thinking, natural law isn't that a universal, unchanging concept? But Vico challenges that assumption.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does Vico's understanding of natural law differ from the traditional view?
Well, he believed that natural law itself evolves over time, reflecting the different stages of societal development. Remember those ages of gods, heroes, and men? Each age, according to Vico, has its own distinct form of natural law.
So it's like saying that our understanding of what's natural, what's right and wrong, isn't fixed, but rather changes as societies evolve.
Precisely. And this idea is incredibly radical for the 17th century. It challenges the very foundations of moral philosophy and forces us to reconsider the relationship between culture, history, and ethics.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about these three kinds of natural law. How do they manifest in each of Vico's historical ages?
Well, in the Age of Gods, imagine a world ruled by fear and awe. Natural law in this stage is divine law. It's based on the perceived whims of the gods.
A world where storms are seen as divine punishments and good harvests as rewards for piety. It's a very different understanding of the relationship between humanity and nature, isn't it?
Completely different. And in this world, the pronouncements of priests, shamans, or oracles are seen as expressions of divine law. The sacred permeates every aspect of life.
So there's no separation between religious law and natural law. They're one and the same. Then how does this shift as we move into the Age of Heroes?
Well, think about the world of the Iliad. It's a world where strength, cunning, and honor are paramount. Natural law becomes heroic law, the law of the battlefield, where might makes right.
So we're seeing a shift from divine authority to human power, but it's still a very hierarchical, aristocratic system. What does this heroic law look like in practice?
It's about protecting the privileges of the warrior class, maintaining order through force, and upholding a code of honor that values courage, loyalty, and military prowess.
And finally, we reach the Age of Men, where reason and reflection take center stage. How does natural law evolve in this age?
Well, here we see the ingredients of human law. The law of equality, of rationality, of the common good. This is the kind of law we're more familiar with today, at least in theory. It's based on the idea that all humans have certain inherent rights, that law should be based on reason and fairness, and that it should serve the interests of the whole community, not just a select few.
So it's a radical shift from the previous ages, a move towards a more egalitarian and just society. But even in this Age of Men, Vico seems to be suggesting that there are still echoes of the earlier forms of natural law.
He does. And this is where his cyclical view of history comes back into play. He recognized that even as we strive to create a more rational and just society, we're always in danger of falling back into the patterns of the past.
So the seeds of barbarism are still there, even in the most enlightened age. It's a sobering thought, but also, I think, a realistic one. We see this playing out all the time in history, the way that societies can swing from periods of great progress to periods of violence and upheaval.
And for Vico, that's why it's so important to understand history, to study the past not just as a collection of dates and facts, but as a living laboratory where we can observe these patterns playing out and learn from the mistakes of previous societies.
It's like he's saying that history is our greatest teacher if we're willing to listen.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial aspect of Vico's thought, his analysis of language. Remember, for Vico, language wasn't just a tool for communication, it was a window into the human mind, a reflection of how we make sense of the world.
Right. And as societies evolve, language evolves too. He saw this progression from the poetic language of the Age of Gods to the more rhetorical language of the Age of Heroes, and finally to the abstract and analytical language of the Age of Men.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that he doesn't see these as completely separate stages. He believes that even in the Age of Reason, the poetic origins of language never entirely disappear. We still use metaphors, we still tell stories, we're still moved by the power of language to evoke emotions and create meaning.
So it's like saying that there's always a bit of the poet in us, even if we think of ourselves as rational beings.
Precisely. And for Vico, this is a good thing. He believed that this poetic element in language is what connects us to our shared humanity, what allows us to create meaning and purpose, what helps us make sense of the world in a way that reason alone cannot.
So it's not a question of reason versus imagination, but rather of finding a way to integrate them, to create a harmonious balance between the analytical and the poetic, the head and the heart.
Exactly. And that brings us to Vico's ultimate goal, his vision of a new science. He dreamed of a science that would embrace both the rational and the imaginative, the historical and the eternal, the individual and the collective.
A science that would reflect the full richness and complexity of the human experience, that would help us understand not just the world out there, but also our own place within it, our own capacity for both creativity and destruction, progress and decline.
And that brings us to the fascinating question of Vico's view of human nature. Was he an optimist, believing in the possibility of progress? Or was he a pessimist, focused on the cyclical patterns of rise and fall?
It's a question that any philosopher engaging with Vico would want to wrestle with. What do you think? Where does Vico land on the optimism-pessimism spectrum?
It's a question that any philosopher engaging with Vico would want to wrestle with. What do you think? Where does Vico land on the optimism-pessimism spectrum?
Well, from what we've discussed so far, it seems like he saw both the potential for greatness and the capacity for self-destruction. In humanity, he recognized those cyclical patterns of history, the rise and fall of civilizations. But he also saw each cycle as an opportunity for growth and renewal.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. He wasn't like a naive optimist who
Yeah.
believed in this linear progress, but he also wasn't like a cynical pessimist who just saw history as this meaningless repetition of the same mistakes. You know what I mean? He held this nuanced view, acknowledging the darkness, but also holding on to this belief in the human capacity for creativity, wisdom, and even like redemption.
So he's saying that history is this tapestry, woven with both light and shadow. And it's up to each generation to choose which threads to emphasize, which patterns to repeat, which new designs to create.
Exactly. And that's why he placed so much emphasis on the importance of understanding history, of learning from the past, of cultivating those virtues that can help us break free from the destructive cycles and create a more just and flourishing future.
And this brings us back to one of his most intriguing and perhaps most challenging ideas, this concept of poetic wisdom. It's not just about writing poems. It's about cultivating this way of seeing the world that embraces both reason and imagination.
Exactly. Poetic wisdom for Vico is about recognizing the limits of reason alone and understanding that truth can also be found in myths, metaphors, and stories. It's about connecting with our shared humanity, with those deeper truths that speak to the heart as well as the mind.
So it's like saying that we need to recover a sense of wonder, of mystery, of the sacred, even as we continue to value reason and critical thinking. It's about finding that balance between the head and the heart, the analytical and the intuitive.
Absolutely. And this poetic wisdom, as Vico saw it, was essential for creating a truly just and flourishing society. He believed that without it, societies would inevitably fall into the trap of the barbarism of reflection.
And that barbarism of reflection is such a potent phrase. It's a reminder that reason, when taken to an extreme, can become cold, calculating,
Yeah.
detached from the human element. It can lead to societies that are efficient, orderly, and even technologically advanced, but ultimately lack soul, compassion, and a sense of shared purpose.
Exactly. And that's why Vico's work is so timely, you know? We live in this world that often celebrates reason and technology above all else. But Vico reminds us we need more than that. We need a sense of meaning, a connection to something larger than ourselves, a shared story that binds us together.
And that's where the poetic comes in, that ability to create those narratives, those myths, those symbols that capture the human imagination and inspire us to strive for something greater than ourselves.
Precisely. And for Vico, this poetic impulse wasn't something to be, outgrown or suppressed. It was a vital part of what makes us human, a source of creativity, wisdom, and ultimately of hope.
So for our philosopher listener who's been grappling with these questions about the nature of knowledge, the limits of reason, and the search for meaning, in a complex world, Vico offers a profound and challenging perspective. He's not giving us easy answers, but he's opening up new ways of seeing, new ways of thinking, new ways of being in the world.
Exactly. He's inviting us to embark on this journey of intellectual and spiritual exploration, to embrace the complexity of the human experience, to rediscover the power of the poetic, and to create a future that's worthy of our humanity.
And that's a journey worth taking, even if it leads us through some unexpected twists and turns. Now, we've talked a lot about Vico's big ideas, his grand vision of history and human nature, but I'm curious to hear more about the specifics of his analysis. For example, you mentioned earlier his fascinating and somewhat controversial interpretation of Homer. Can you tell us more about what Vico called the new Homer?
Absolutely. Remember how we talked about Vico seeing early humans as sublime poets? Well, he saw Homer as the embodiment of this poetic spirit. But here's the twist. He didn't believe that Homer was a single historical individual in the way we typically understand authorship today.
So he wasn't like Shakespeare, where we have historical records and can trace the evolution of his works.
Exactly. For Vico, Homer was more of an archetype, a symbol of the poetic wisdom that permeated ancient Greek culture.
So almost like this collective voice, channeling the shared understanding of a whole people.
Precisely. He believed that Homer's poems weren't the product of a single mind, but rather a reflection of the sensus communis of the ancient Greeks, their shared values, beliefs, and ways of seeing the world.
And those poems, the Iliad, the Odyssey, they weren't just stories for entertainment, were they? Vico saw them as something much more profound.
He did. He saw them as a kind of cultural encyclopedia, a repository of knowledge and wisdom. That shaped how the Greeks understood themselves and their place in the cosmos. These epic tales of gods and heroes, of wars and journeys, of love and loss, they weren't just entertainment. They were a way of transmitting cultural values, moral codes, and even philosophical insights from one generation to the next.
So it's like saying that the poems were a form of education, a way of shaping the minds and hearts of the Greek people. And for Vico, this poetic education wasn't something to be, like, outgrown or discarded.
Yeah.
As societies became more advanced, he saw it as a vital source of wisdom that was essential for any flourishing society.
Exactly. And this is where his idea of the new Homer comes in. He believed that we need to rediscover this poetic wisdom, this ability to see the world through the eyes of the imagination as well as the intellect. We need to create our own new Homers, our own stories and myths that speak to the challenges and possibilities of our own time.
It's a powerful idea, and it makes me wonder what those new Homers might look like today. Would they be poets in the traditional sense, or would they be filmmakers, novelists, musicians, even video game designers? Anyone who's able to create those compelling narratives that capture our imagination and help us make sense of the world around us.
That's a great question. And I think Vico would say that it's not limited to any particular art form. It's about the spirit, the impulse, that ability to see the world with fresh eyes, to connect with those deeper truths that often elude reason alone.
So it's a call to cultivate our own inner poets, to find those ways of expressing ourselves that tap into the power of imagination and help us make sense of the world in a more holistic, more humane, meaningful way.
Exactly. And that's a challenge that's relevant for all of us, not just philosophers. It's a challenge to reclaim the poetic, to rediscover the power of storytelling, to build a world where reason and imagination can dance together, where the past illuminates the present, and where the human spirit can flourish in all its complexity and beauty.
And as we wrap up this deep dive into the mind of Giambattista Vico, I think that's a perfect note to end on. He's given us so much to think about, so many ideas to grapple with, so many possibilities to explore. He's challenged our assumptions about history, language, knowledge, and even the very nature of what it means to be human.
He has, and he's reminded us that the pursuit of knowledge isn't just about accumulating facts and figures. It's about seeking wisdom,
Yeah.
about understanding ourselves and our place in the world, and ultimately about creating a future that's worthy of our humanity.
So thank you for joining us on this journey into the fascinating and challenging world of Giambattista Vico. We hope it sparked your curiosity, ignited your imagination, and maybe even inspired you to go out and create your own new Homer. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking that poetic wisdom that can light our way forward.